rain came without warning, and so did the sound of a carriage wheel cracking against stone. Eleanor Hastings pressed herself against the trunk of an old oak, watching sparks fly from the broken axle as the horses reared in fright. A man's voice cut through the storm, sharp and commanding, ordering the driver to calm the animals before someone was hurt. She had never seen him before, yet something in his voice made her step out from the shelter of the tree instead of staying hidden, as any sensible woman would have done on a night like this. He turned toward her the moment she moved, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke. Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his coat, clearly expensive, was already ruined by the mud. He looked, in that instant, nothing like a duke, and everything like a man caught helpless in bad weather. "You should not be out here alone," he said, striding toward her, though his tone held concern rather than command. "Neither should you," Eleanor replied before she could stop herself. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed quickly by something that resembled amusement. Few people spoke to him that way, and fewer still dared to do it with such calm certainty. "I am Alexander," he said, offering no title, no family name, only the simple truth of himself standing in the rain. "Eleanor," she answered, and left it at that. The carriage could not be repaired that night, and so Alexander insisted on walking her the remaining distance to the modest cottage where she lodged, near the edge of the Ashworth estate. The walk should have taken only minutes, yet somehow it stretched into nearly an hour, filled with conversation that neither of them seemed eager to end. He asked about her work as a governess to the Ashworth children, and she found herself laughing at his surprise when she described the chaos of teaching 3 boys under the age of 10. "You do not seem troubled by the difficulty of it," he observed. "Difficulty keeps life interesting," she said. "I imagine your days are far less eventful." If only she knew how wrong she was. Alexander's days were filled with ledgers, obligations, and the constant weight of a family name stretching back centuries. But standing there in the rain, none of that mattered. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like an ordinary man having an ordinary conversation, and he was in no hurry for it to end. When they finally reached her door, he lingered a moment too long before saying goodnight. It was only after he had gone that Eleanor realized she had never asked his surname, and by then it was too late to wonder, because sleep took her quickly, filled with the strange warmth of having met someone unlike anyone she had known before. She did not learn the truth until 3 days later, when Charlotte, the housekeeper's daughter and her closest friend at Ashworth, mentioned in passing that the Duke of Faircross had been seen riding near the Eastern Road the same night a carriage had broken down. Eleanor's hand stilled over the book she had been holding. "The Duke?" "Alexander Whitmore," Charlotte said, not noticing the color draining from Eleanor's face. "Heir to one of the oldest houses in the country. They say he is soon to be engaged to Lady Beatrice Ashcombe. A grand match, everyone says. Very suitable." The word suitable settled uncomfortably in Eleanor's chest. She thought of the man in the rain, the one who had walked beside her without pretense, who had laughed freely and spoken to her as an equal. It seemed impossible that he could be the same man now spoken of with such formality, such distance. Yet he was. 2 days later, a letter arrived, carried by a servant in plain clothing rather than livery, clearly meant to avoid notice. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands. "I did not tell you who I was because, for one evening, I did not want to be him. I hope you will forgive the omission, and allow me the chance to see you again, if only to prove that the man you met in the rain was not a lie." She should have refused. Every instinct told her that a duke and a governess belonged to different worlds, worlds that were never meant to touch, let alone intertwine. But when she thought of his voice, steady and warm despite the storm, she found herself reaching for pen and paper instead of walking away. Their second meeting took place at the edge of the woods separating the Ashworth and Faircross estates, a place chosen deliberately for its distance from prying eyes. Alexander arrived on horseback, dismounting the moment he saw her waiting beneath the trees. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I told myself I would not," Eleanor admitted, "and yet here I am." They walked together along the tree line, and this time there was no rain to excuse the length of their conversation. No broken carriage to explain why neither wanted to leave. Alexander spoke, carefully at first, about the expectations placed upon him since childhood, the marriage being arranged on his behalf, the weight of a family name that felt, at times, more like a chain than an honor. "You speak of it as though you have no choice," Eleanor said quietly. "I have not been given one," he replied. "Not truly. Not since I was old enough to understand what my birth required of me." She wanted to ask why he was telling her this, a woman he had known for only a handful of days, but some part of her already understood. He was telling her because, For reasons neither of them could fully explain, he trusted her with the truth in a way he trusted almost no one else. As the weeks passed, their meetings became a quiet, dangerous habit. They met beneath the same trees, walked the same paths, careful always to avoid the eyes of servants and travelers who might carry word back to the great houses on either side of the woods. Eleanor told herself each time that it would be the last, that continuing was foolish, even reckless. Yet each time, when Alexander's letter arrived requesting another meeting, she found herself unable to refuse. It was during one of these meetings, beneath a sky turning gold with the last light of evening, that Alexander finally admitted what he had been trying not to say for weeks. "I think of you more than I should," he said, his voice low. "I think of you when I ought to be thinking of matters far more important. I have tried to stop Eleanor, and I cannot." She turned to face him, her heart beating unevenly. "You are promised to another." "I am promised to an arrangement," he corrected gently. "Not to a person. There is a difference, though I do not expect the difference to matter to anyone but myself." Eleanor knew, even as her heart lifted at his words, that the difference would matter a great deal to everyone else. It would matter to his mother, the formidable Duchess Margaret, who had spent years securing the match with the Ashcombe family. It would matter to Lord Henry Ashcombe, whose daughter's future depended on the marriage proceeding as planned. It would matter to the entire court, which watched the great houses with the sharp attention of those who thrived on scandal and gossip. And yet, standing there with the golden light fading around them, none of that felt as real as the man before her, or the quiet certainty in his eyes. "This cannot end well," she whispered. "Perhaps not," Alexander agreed. "But I find I would rather face whatever comes than pretend I do not feel what I feel." He did not touch her that evening, not even her hand, though the distance between them seemed to shrink with every word spoken. It was enough, for now, simply to have said the truth aloud, to have let it exist between them instead of hidden away. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line, half hidden by the dimming light, until it was too late to matter. Whispers, once started, had a way of spreading faster than either of them could have imagined, and by the time Eleanor returned to the cottage that night, the first quiet rumor had already begun its journey toward the great house of Faircross. She did not know it yet, but the storm that had brought them together was nothing compared to the one now gathering on the horizon, one that would test every promise, every loyalty, and every ounce of courage either of them possessed. That night, Eleanor lay awake long after the candle had burned down, turning the evening over in her mind again and again. She thought of the way Alexander had looked at her, not as a duke looks at a servant, but as one person looks at another when nothing else in the world seems to matter. She told herself it was foolish to hold on to such a feeling, that men of his standing did not build futures with women like her. And yet, when she closed her eyes, it was his voice she heard, steady and sure, promising nothing but honesty. Miles away, in the vast quiet of Faircross Hall, Alexander sat by his window long after the household had gone to sleep. He knew what he had said beneath the trees could not be taken back, and strangely, he did not wish to take it back. For years he had moved through life according to a plan written long before his birth, a plan that left no room for choice, no room for feeling. Eleanor had, without meaning to, shown him the shape of a different life, one built on something more honest than duty. He thought of his mother, the Duchess Margaret, whose sharp eyes missed nothing within the walls of their estate. He thought of Lady Beatrice, a woman he respected but had never loved, bound to him by agreements made between their fathers years before either of them had a voice in the matter. And he thought of the figure he had glimpsed at the edge of the trees just before leaving, a shadow that had vanished too quickly to identify, but not quickly enough to be forgotten. Somewhere in the darkness, word was already beginning to travel. A stable hand had mentioned to a maid that the Duke's horse had been seen tied near the eastern woods on more than one evening. The maid, in turn, had mentioned it to a friend in the kitchens, who mentioned it to no one in particular, simply because it seemed an interesting thing to say. Rumors, once loosed, rarely stayed contained, and this one was no exception. By morning, the whisper had reached ears far more dangerous than a kitchen maid's, ears belonging to those who understood exactly what such a rumor could mean for the delicate balance of alliances resting on Alexander's upcoming marriage. Eleanor woke to a knock at her door earlier than usual. Charlotte stood outside, her expression unusually serious. "There is talk," Charlotte said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as though the very walls might be listening. "About the Duke, and about someone he has been seen with near the eastern woods." Eleanor's stomach tightened. What kind of talk? "Nothing certain yet," Charlotte admitted. "But you know how quickly certainty stops mattering once a story begins to spread." Eleanor thanked her friend for the warning, though the words did little to ease the unease settling over her. She dressed for her duties as governess, moving through the familiar routine of lessons and meals with the Ashworth children, all the while feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted overnight. What had felt, only hours before, like a private and precious secret now felt fragile, exposed to a world that would not be kind to it. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile secret would be tested, nor how far the consequences would reach. But as she watched the children practice their letters that morning, her mind kept drifting back to the woods, to the golden light, and to the quiet certainty in Alexander's voice. Whatever came next, she realized, there would be no simple way to undo what had already begun. The Duchess Margaret Whitmore had not become the most respected woman in the county by ignoring whispers. She had built her entire life on the ability to hear a rumor before it fully formed, and to act before it could cause damage. So when her personal maid, Grace, mentioned in passing that stable talk placed the Duke near the eastern woods on several recent evenings, Margaret did not dismiss it as idle gossip. She simply waited, watched, and gathered more. 3 days later, she summoned Alexander to her private study, a room that had witnessed the making and breaking of countless family decisions long before he was born. She did not raise her voice when he entered, nor did she waste time with pleasantries. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Alexander obeyed, though something in his mother's composed manner told him this was not an ordinary conversation. "I understand you have been seen near the eastern woods," Margaret began, folding her hands neatly before her. "More than once, according to what I have heard." "I ride there often," Alexander replied evenly. "It has always been one of my favorite paths." "Do not insult me by pretending I am a fool, Alexander." Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I know about the governess, Eleanor Hastings, I believe her name is." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. Denial, he knew, would only make things worse. "Her name is Eleanor, yes, and what I feel for her is not something I can simply set aside because it is inconvenient." Margaret's expression did not change, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes, something that might have been sympathy, or might have been fear, or perhaps both. Inconvenient is not the word I would choose. Dangerous is closer to the truth. "You are betrothed, Alexander, in all but formal announcement, to Lady Beatrice Ashcombe. That match secures more than your happiness. It secures the future of this family, the stability of 2 estates, and agreements made years before either of us had a say in the matter." "I understand what is at stake," Alexander said quietly. "I have understood it since I was old enough to understand anything." "Then you understand why this cannot continue," Margaret replied, her tone final. "Whatever affection you believe you feel for this young woman, it must end, quietly and completely, before it becomes something neither of us can control." Alexander rose from his chair, his composure fraying at the edges despite his effort to maintain it. "You speak of my life as though it belongs entirely to this family, to this name, and to agreements I never chose." "Your life has always belonged to this family," Margaret said, standing as well, meeting her son's gaze without flinching. "That is the price of the position you were born into. I did not choose it either, Alexander, yet I have spent my entire life honoring it." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them. Alexander wanted to argue further, to insist that duty should not require the complete abandonment of his own heart, but he knew his mother well enough to understand that further argument would accomplish nothing tonight. Instead, he left the study without another word, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a stone he could not set down. That same evening, word of the Duchess's concern reached the Ashworth estate through channels far less direct but no less effective. Charlotte, whose mother worked closely with several households in the region, heard from a cousin employed at Faircross that the Duchess had spoken privately with her son about a certain governess. By the time the story reached Eleanor, it had grown vaguer in detail, but sharper in warning. "You must be careful," Charlotte urged her friend the next morning, pulling her aside before the children woke for their lessons. "If the Duchess knows, others will soon know as well, and you know how unkind people can be toward someone in your position, should they decide you have overstepped." Eleanor understood the warning for exactly what it was. A woman without title or fortune who dared to capture the attention of a duke risked far more than heartbreak. She risked her reputation, her employment, and quite possibly her entire future. And yet, even as fear crept into her thoughts, she found she could not bring herself to regret the evenings spent beneath the trees, nor the words Alexander had spoken beneath the golden light. Days passed without any word from Alexander, and the silence began to weigh on Eleanor more heavily than any rumor. She told herself it was for the best, that distance would protect them both, that whatever had grown between them in those stolen hours was never meant to survive contact with the wider world. Still, each morning she found herself glancing toward the tree line, half hoping and half dreading the sight of him waiting there. It was nearly 2 weeks before a letter finally arrived, delivered again by a servant dressed plainly enough to avoid notice. Eleanor recognized Alexander's handwriting immediately, and her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. My mother knows. I do not say this to frighten you, but because I believe you deserve the truth rather than silence. She has made her wishes clear, and I understand the risk that continuing to see you now poses, not only to my own position, but to yours as well. I have thought of little else since our last meeting, and though I know the wise course would be to stay away, I find myself unable to simply let you go without one more conversation. If you are willing, meet me at the old chapel ruins beyond the northern field, 3 nights from now, after moonrise. If you do not come, I will understand, and I will trouble you no further. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest, as though the simple act might steady the storm of feeling rising within her. Every practical instinct told her to burn the letter and forget the invitation entirely. To continue now, with the Duchess already aware and rumors already spreading, would be reckless beyond anything she had allowed herself before. And yet, when the 3rd night arrived, Eleanor found herself walking quietly toward the northern field, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something closer to hope. The chapel ruins stood silent beneath a sky scattered with stars, its broken walls a fitting shelter for 2 people whose meeting the world would not sanction. Alexander was already waiting when she arrived, standing near what remained of the old stone archway, his expression a mixture of relief and quiet dread. You came, he said softly. I told myself I would not, Eleanor admitted, echoing words she had spoken weeks before, though this time the weight behind them felt far heavier. My mother believes ending this would protect us both, Alexander said, stepping closer. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps the wisest course is to accept what our positions demand of us, and part ways, before either of us is hurt further. Eleanor's chest tightened at his words, though she forced herself to remain steady. And what do you believe? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers as though searching for something he was not entirely certain he would find. I believe, he said finally, that I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, and that for the first time, I do not wish to continue doing so without at least understanding what the alternative might feel like. That is not the same as choosing me, Eleanor said quietly, though there was no accusation in her voice, only honesty. No, Alexander agreed, not yet, but it is the beginning of considering that such a choice might be possible. They spoke for nearly an hour beneath the broken archway, discussing not grand declarations but smaller truths, the kind of truths people share when they are beginning to trust one another with something fragile. Eleanor told him of her own family, modest and unremarkable by the standards of the court, yet full of warmth and honesty she had rarely encountered elsewhere. Alexander told her, in turn, of the loneliness that came with a life defined entirely by obligation, of how rare it felt to speak with someone who wanted nothing from him beyond honest conversation. Before they parted, Alexander finally reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own. It was the first time he had touched her, and the simple contact felt far more significant than either of them could have anticipated. Whatever happens, he said quietly, I do not regret this. I do not regret any of it. Eleanor squeezed his hand in return, though she could not bring herself to promise the same certainty. As she walked back toward the cottage that night, her mind turned over the risks now facing them both, risks that seemed to grow heavier with every meeting rather than lighter. She did not know that, even as she walked home beneath the stars, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe had already begun to hear the same rumors that had reached the Duchess, nor did she know how differently Beatrice would choose to respond to them once the truth became impossible to ignore. The quiet chapter of secret meetings was drawing to a close, and what followed would test both Alexander and Eleanor far more severely than either of them yet understood. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe had known about the rumors for nearly a week before she said a single word to her father. She was not a woman easily shaken by gossip, having grown up within a household where whispered scandal was simply the price of a prominent name. Yet these particular whispers troubled her more than most, not because they threatened her pride, but because they forced her to confront a truth she had long avoided admitting even to herself. She did not love Alexander Whitmore, nor had she ever pretended to. Their engagement had been arranged years earlier by their fathers, 2 men more concerned with securing land and influence than with the happiness of their children. Beatrice had accepted the arrangement as simply the way of things, the way most matches among families of consequence were made. But hearing that Alexander had found something resembling genuine affection elsewhere stirred in her an unexpected mixture of relief and quiet resentment, relief that perhaps she too might one day be free to choose differently. and resentment that he had been given the chance to feel such things, while she had resigned herself to duty without complaint. Her father, Lord Henry Ashcombe, held no such complicated feelings. When the rumors reached him, delivered discreetly by an associate eager to curry favor, his reaction was immediate and calculated. "This cannot be allowed to continue," he told Beatrice over dinner one evening, his voice low despite the empty dining hall around them. "If the engagement collapses now, after years of careful arrangement, the damage to this family's standing would be considerable. We cannot allow some governess to undo what has taken a decade to build. Perhaps the engagement was never meant to withstand the introduction of genuine feeling," Beatrice said quietly, surprising even herself with the boldness of the remark. Lord Henry's expression darkened. "Feeling has little place in matters such as these, Beatrice. You know this as well as I do. What matters is the alliance, the stability it provides, and the future it secures for both our families." Beatrice said nothing further that evening, though her father's words settled uncomfortably within her. She had spent years accepting the same reasoning he now offered. Yet for the first time, she found herself questioning whether stability alone was truly worth the cost of happiness, hers or Alexander's. Lord Henry, however, was not a man to leave matters to chance. Within days, he had quietly set in motion a plan designed to eliminate the threat Eleanor Hastings posed to the engagement, without directly involving his daughter or drawing attention to his own role in the matter. He understood well enough that a direct confrontation would only fuel further scandal. What was needed instead was something quieter, something that would remove Eleanor from consideration without ever appearing connected to the Ashcombe family at all. He began by reaching out to acquaintances within the household surrounding Ashworth Estate, individuals who owed him favors or hoped to earn his goodwill. Through careful and deliberate conversation, unflattering stories about Eleanor began to circulate, stories suggesting she had a history of inappropriate behavior in previous positions, that she had been dismissed from an earlier household under circumstances too delicate to discuss openly, that her interest in the Duke was nothing more than calculated ambition dressed in false modesty. None of it was true, but truth mattered little once a story gained enough momentum. Within a fortnight, the whispers had grown loud enough that Eleanor herself could no longer ignore them. It began subtly, with sideways glances from other members of the Ashworth household staff, glances that had once been friendly but now carried a hint of suspicion. Then came the comments, offhand remarks disguised as concern, suggesting perhaps Eleanor ought to consider her position carefully, given the sort of talk now circulating about her character. By the time Charlotte approached her friend with a troubled expression one afternoon, Eleanor already suspected what news she was about to receive. "They are saying dreadful things," Charlotte admitted, her voice heavy with frustration on her friend's behalf. "That you were dismissed from your previous position for improper conduct. That your interest in the Duke has always been about advancing your own circumstances rather than genuine feeling. I know none of it is true, Eleanor, but I fear the story is spreading faster than either of us can stop it." Eleanor felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her once again, this time far more violently than before. Where could such stories have come from? "I have done nothing to deserve them." "I do not know," Charlotte admitted, though a troubled look crossed her face, as though she suspected more than she was willing to say aloud. The following days brought little relief. Mistress Ashworth, the lady of the house where Eleanor had served faithfully for nearly 2 years, called her into a private meeting, her expression apologetic but firm. "I have always found your work with the children to be exemplary," Mistress Ashworth began carefully. "However, given the nature of the rumors now circulating, I fear I must consider the reputation of this household as well as your own position within it. I am not accusing you of anything, Eleanor, but you must understand the position this places me in." "I have done nothing wrong," Eleanor said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "The stories being told are entirely false." "Perhaps they are," Mistress Ashworth replied gently, "but false stories, once believed, can cause damage every bit as real as true ones. I am sorry, Eleanor, truly I am, but I believe it would be best, for now, if you sought a position elsewhere, somewhere removed from the attention currently surrounding this household." Eleanor left the meeting with her composure barely intact, the weight of injustice settling heavily upon her. She had done nothing to invite the scandal now threatening to unravel everything she had worked to build, and yet she found herself facing the loss of her position, her reputation, and quite possibly her future, all because she had allowed herself to care for a man whose world was never meant to intersect with hers. Word of Eleanor's dismissal reached Alexander through a source considerably more reliable than court gossip. His personal aide, Edmund, a man who had served the Whitmore family faithfully for over a decade, and had come to respect Alexander's judgment even when it defied convention, brought the news directly to him one evening. She has been asked to leave her position, Edmund reported quietly, closing the study door behind him to ensure privacy. The rumors surrounding her character have grown too damaging for Mistress Ashworth to ignore, regardless of their truth. Alexander's expression hardened. These rumors are entirely fabricated. Eleanor has done nothing to deserve such treatment. I do not doubt it, Edmund replied, but someone clearly wishes her removed from consideration, Your Grace, and I suspect the effort did not originate by accident. Alexander considered this carefully, his mind turning immediately to Lord Henry Ashcombe, a man known throughout the court for his willingness to protect his family's interests through whatever means necessary. He had no proof, not yet, but the timing of the rumors, appearing so soon after his mother's confrontation regarding Eleanor, seemed far too convenient to dismiss as coincidence. I intend to help her, Alexander said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. Not openly, not yet, for that would only worsen the situation, but I will not allow her to suffer for feelings I encouraged, simply because I lack the courage to intervene. Over the following days, Alexander worked carefully and discreetly to counter the damage done to Eleanor's reputation. He could not act directly, not without confirming the very rumors he sought to disprove, so instead he relied on Edmund and a small network of trusted associates to quietly correct the false narrative circulating through the region. Edmund visited several of the households where the rumors had taken hold, offering, without revealing his true purpose, factual accounts of Eleanor's character and history that contradicted the fabricated stories. At the same time, Alexander used his own influence to secure Eleanor a new position, one far enough removed from both Ashworth and Faircross to avoid immediate suspicion, yet respectable enough to restore some measure of her standing. He arranged, through an intermediary unconnected to either family, for Eleanor to be offered a position teaching at a well-regarded school for young women in a neighboring county, a position that would provide both income and a measure of protection from the scandal still circulating in her previous circle. Eleanor received the offer without knowing its true source, believing it to be simply good fortune arriving at a moment when she desperately needed it. She accepted gratefully, relieved to have found a path forward despite the damage done to her reputation, though a part of her could not help wondering at the timing of such an opportunity appearing so precisely when she needed it most. It was Charlotte, ever perceptive, who first suspected the truth. "You do not find it curious," she asked one evening, as Eleanor prepared to depart for her new position, "that such a fortunate opportunity presented itself so quickly, and so precisely suited to your circumstances?" Eleanor paused, considering the question seriously for the first time. "You believe someone arranged this deliberately?" "I believe," Charlotte said carefully, "that certain people with considerable influence have reason to wish you protected, even if they cannot be seen protecting you directly." Eleanor said nothing further on the matter, though the suspicion Charlotte had planted lingered in her thoughts long after her friend's words had faded. She wanted to believe Alexander had played some part in her rescue, yet she also understood the danger such an assumption carried. If he had indeed intervened on her behalf, it meant he was willing to risk exposure and scandal to protect her, a risk that could prove disastrous for them both should the truth ever surface. Meanwhile, within the walls of Faircross Hall, the situation had grown considerably more complicated. The Duchess Margaret, though she had insisted her son end all contact with Eleanor, had not been entirely deceived by his outward compliance. She noticed the increased frequency of Edmund's quiet errands, the careful way Alexander avoided direct questions about the governess's whereabouts, the subtle change in his demeanor that suggested a man still deeply preoccupied despite his mother's demands. She said nothing directly, choosing instead to watch and wait, understanding that direct confrontation had already failed to produce the result she desired. Instead, she turned her attention toward accelerating the formal engagement between Alexander and Beatrice, believing that a public announcement, once made, would remove any remaining possibility of her son abandoning the arrangement. She approached Lord Henry Ashcombe directly, proposing that the formal betrothal be announced at an upcoming gathering of considerable importance within the court, an event attended by nearly every family of consequence in the region. Lord Henry agreed readily, seeing in the proposal an opportunity to finally secure the alliance he had worked so diligently to protect. A formal announcement, made publicly and before witnesses of importance, would leave little room for further complication, Lord Henry observed during their meeting. "That is precisely my intention," Margaret replied. "Once the engagement is announced before the entire court, my son will understand the impossibility of continuing whatever foolish attachment has distracted him these past weeks." Neither of them consulted Beatrice directly regarding the timing of the announcement, a fact that troubled her considerably once she learned of the plan. She had grown increasingly uncertain about the marriage in recent weeks. uncertain in a way she had never allowed herself to feel before Alexander's attachment to Eleanor had become known. Watching him struggle so visibly against the demands placed upon him had, unexpectedly, caused Beatrice to reconsider her own resignation to a marriage built entirely on obligation rather than genuine affection. She said nothing of these doubts to her father, understanding that voicing them now would accomplish little beyond inviting his displeasure. Instead, she began quietly observing Alexander whenever their paths crossed at social gatherings, searching for some sign of what he truly felt, and finding, each time, a man clearly torn between duty and desire, in a way that stirred within her both sympathy and a growing determination of her own. As the date of the planned announcement drew closer, tension within both households grew increasingly difficult to contain. Alexander received word of his mother's plan through Edmund, who had overheard enough of the arrangements between Margaret and Lord Henry to understand the announcement's significance. "They intend to make the engagement official before the entire court," Edmund reported, his tone grave. "Once announced publicly, withdrawing from the arrangement would bring considerable scandal upon both families." Alexander absorbed this news with a heaviness that settled deep in his chest. He understood precisely what his mother intended, a final and irreversible step designed to eliminate any possibility of choosing differently. The formal weight of a public announcement, made before nobles, allies, and rivals alike, would leave him trapped by circumstance, in a way private conversation alone had not yet managed to achieve. He thought of Eleanor, now settled into her new position, believing herself safely removed from the danger surrounding her previous circumstances. He thought of the quiet strength she had shown throughout the ordeal, never once blaming him for the difficulties her association with him had caused. And he thought too of the choice now rapidly approaching, a choice that would soon become impossible to avoid or delay any further. Whatever course he chose, Alexander understood that the coming weeks would determine not only his own future but the future of everyone connected to this increasingly tangled web of duty, deception, and quiet, determined love. The court gathering where the engagement was to be announced loomed ahead like a storm no one, not Alexander, not Eleanor, not even the formidable Duchess Margaret herself, could fully control once it finally arrived. The great hall at Ashcombe Manor had been transformed for the occasion. Its high windows draped with fine fabric and its long tables set with more silver than most guests would see displayed in a single evening anywhere else that year. Every family of consequence within the region had received an invitation, and nearly all of them had accepted, drawn by curiosity as much as obligation, since word of the upcoming announcement had spread through the court with remarkable speed. Alexander arrived beside his mother, dressed in formal attire that felt, to him, more like armor than clothing. He greeted guests with practiced composure, exchanging pleasantries with families whose names he had known since childhood, all the while feeling the evening's true purpose settling over him like an approaching storm he could neither avoid nor delay. Beatrice stood near her father when Alexander arrived, dressed elegantly in pale blue, her expression composed, though her eyes carried a weight that suggested thoughts far heavier than the occasion's celebratory tone might have implied. When their gazes met across the hall, something passed silently between them, an understanding neither had spoken aloud but both clearly recognized. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else this evening," Beatrice observed quietly, once Alexander had made his way to her side, as protocol required. "I confess the feeling is difficult to disguise," Alexander admitted, matching her honesty with his own. Beatrice studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I have spent considerable time thinking about tonight, Alexander. About what it means for both of us, and about whether either of us has truly consented to what is about to happen, or simply allowed it to happen because refusing seemed impossible." Alexander's attention sharpened at her words, surprised by the directness of a conversation he had not expected from her. "What are you saying, Beatrice?" "I am saying," she replied carefully, "that I have watched you these past weeks, and I have seen a man clearly unwilling despite every effort to appear otherwise. I do not wish to spend my life married to unwillingness, Alexander, however comfortable the arrangement might otherwise prove." Before Alexander could respond further, Lord Henry approached, his expression bright with anticipation for the evening ahead, entirely unaware of the conversation his daughter had just initiated. "The musicians are ready to begin shortly, and Duchess Margaret has indicated she wishes the announcement made before the evening progresses too far. Shall we gather the guests?" Alexander nodded stiffly, watching Beatrice's expression settle back into practiced composure, as her father led her toward the center of the hall, where the formal announcement would soon take place. Whatever conversation had passed between them moments earlier, now hung unresolved, leaving Alexander with even less certainty than before, regarding how the evening might unfold. It was at that moment, as guests began arranging themselves near the raised platform where the Duchess intended to make the formal announcement, that Alexander noticed a figure near the far entrance of the hall, a figure whose presence he had never anticipated seeing that evening. Eleanor stood near the doorway, dressed simply compared to the elaborate gowns surrounding her, yet unmistakably herself despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Her expression carried equal parts uncertainty and quiet resolve, as though she had debated the wisdom of attending until the very last possible moment before finally deciding to come regardless of the risk. Alexander's heart caught painfully in his chest. He had no idea how she had learned of the gathering, nor how she had managed to secure entrance to an event clearly intended only for families of considerable standing. What he understood immediately, however, was the danger her presence now posed, not only to herself, but to the delicate situation already threatening to unravel around them both. It was Charlotte, standing quietly near Eleanor, who had made the evening possible. Having learned of the planned announcement through her mother's connections within the Ashcombe household staff, Charlotte had made the difficult decision to inform Eleanor, believing that whatever happened next deserved to happen with Eleanor's knowledge rather than behind her back. "I did not come to cause difficulty," Eleanor had told Charlotte earlier that evening, as they debated whether attending was wise. "I came because I could not bear the thought of learning what happened here secondhand, through rumor and gossip, when I might instead witness the truth for myself, whatever that truth turns out to be." Now, standing at the edge of the grand hall, watching Alexander across the crowded room, Eleanor felt the full weight of that decision settling upon her. She had not come to interrupt the proceedings, nor to demand anything of a man whose obligations she understood far better than most. She had come simply because she needed to see, with her own eyes, however painful the sight might prove, exactly what path Alexander would choose when finally forced to choose openly, rather than in the quiet privacy of stolen meetings. The Duchess Margaret, ascending the raised platform to begin the formal proceedings, had not yet noticed Eleanor's presence among the gathered guests. She began speaking with practiced elegance, welcoming the assembled families and expressing gratitude for their attendance on an occasion of considerable importance to the Whitmore family's future. "It is my great honor," Margaret announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "to formally confirm the engagement between my son, Duke Alexander Whitmore, and Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, a union that has long been anticipated by both our families, and one that I have no doubt will bring considerable prosperity and stability to us all." A murmur of polite approval moved through the gathered guests, the expected response to news that surprised no one, since the arrangement had been anticipated for years. Margaret gestured for Alexander to join her upon the platform, expecting him to step forward and confirm the announcement with the traditional acceptance expected of him. Alexander did not move immediately. For a moment that stretched far longer than its actual duration, he remained where he stood, his gaze fixed not upon his mother or the assembled guests, but upon Eleanor, standing quietly near the entrance, her expression unreadable yet somehow conveying more than words could have managed. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath, guests exchanging confused glances as the expected moment of confirmation failed to arrive as smoothly as anticipated. "Alexander," Margaret said again, her voice carrying a warning edge beneath its outward calm, "please join me." Still, Alexander hesitated, torn between the weight of every expectation placed upon him since birth and the quiet, undeniable truth of what he felt standing in that hall, watching Eleanor watch him in return. The silence stretched further, growing increasingly uncomfortable, whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd as guests began to sense that something unusual was unfolding before them. It was Beatrice, standing beside her father near the platform, who finally broke the mounting tension, though not in the manner anyone present had anticipated. "I believe," Beatrice said, her voice clear and steady despite the weight of every eye in the hall suddenly turning toward her, "that this announcement should not proceed as planned." A collective gasp moved through the gathered guests, followed immediately by an eruption of hushed conversation. Lord Henry turned toward his daughter with an expression of pure astonishment, clearly unprepared for such a public declaration. "Beatrice," he said sharply, though his voice remained low enough to avoid further scandal, "what are you saying?" "I am saying," Beatrice continued, addressing not only her father but the entire assembled hall, "that I will not enter a marriage built upon obligation alone, when it is clear to anyone paying attention that Alexander's heart belongs elsewhere. I have watched him these past weeks, and I have seen a man struggling against a future he does not want. I will not be the reason he continues to struggle." The hall fell into stunned silence, guests exchanging shocked glances as they attempted to process the unexpected turn events had taken. Duchess Margaret stood frozen upon the platform, her carefully constructed composure faltering for the first time that evening, as she watched the arrangement she had spent years securing begin to unravel, before an audience of the very people whose opinion mattered most to her family's standing. "This is neither the time nor the place for such a discussion," Margaret said finally, attempting to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Perhaps not," Beatrice replied, her voice remaining steady despite the weight of every eye upon her. "But I believe it is precisely the right time for honesty, however inconvenient that honesty might prove to everyone gathered here this evening." Lord Henry, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, attempted to intervene, drawing his daughter aside for a hurried, hushed conversation near the edge of the platform. Their exchange remained largely inaudible to the surrounding guests, though the tension visible in both their expressions left little doubt as to its contentious nature. Alexander, meanwhile, found himself finally able to move, crossing the hall not toward his mother or the platform where the interrupted announcement had been meant to proceed, but toward the entrance where Eleanor still stood, watching the unfolding scene with an expression that mixed disbelief with a hope she had not allowed herself to feel until this precise moment. "You should not have come," Alexander said quietly, once he reached her, though his tone carried no true reproach, only concern for the risk she had taken. "Perhaps not," Eleanor replied, echoing Beatrice's earlier words without realizing it. "But I needed to see the truth for myself, whatever that truth turned out to be." "And what have you seen?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper amid the continued murmur of the surrounding crowd. "I have seen a man finally unwilling to pretend," Eleanor said softly. "Whatever happens next, Alexander, I am glad I came." Across the hall, Duchess Margaret watched the exchange between her son and the governess whose presence had now thrown the entire carefully arranged evening into chaos, her mind racing through the implications of what had just transpired before an audience she could not simply dismiss or silence. The engagement she had spent years securing now lay in ruins, dissolved not by scandal or accusation, but by Beatrice's own unexpected refusal to proceed, a refusal that left the Whitmore family's future suddenly, precariously uncertain. She understood, watching her son cross the hall toward Eleanor without hesitation, that whatever control she had once believed herself to hold over his future had finally, irrevocably slipped beyond her grasp. The question now was not whether Alexander would choose Eleanor, for that choice, it seemed, had already been made in every way that mattered. The question was what Margaret herself would choose to do now that the choice had been made so publicly, so undeniably, before the very court whose opinion she had spent her entire life striving to protect. As murmurs continued rippling through the gathered guests, and as Lord Henry's hushed argument with his daughter grew increasingly heated near the platform, Margaret found herself facing a decision she had never anticipated needing to make. Whether tradition or her son's happiness ultimately mattered more was a question she had believed settled long ago. Standing now amid the wreckage of an evening gone entirely differently than planned, she was no longer certain the answer was as simple as she had once believed. The days following the disastrous announcement at Ashcombe Manor passed in a blur of hushed conversation and mounting speculation throughout the court. Word of what had transpired spread quickly, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until the truth of the evening had become almost indistinguishable from rumor and exaggeration. Some claimed Beatrice had refused the marriage out of pride, others insisted the Duke himself had abandoned the arrangement without warning, and still others whispered darkly about the governess, whose presence at the gathering had apparently thrown the entire evening into chaos. Within Faircross Hall, however, the atmosphere carried far less speculation and far more difficult, necessary conversation. Duchess Margaret had summoned Alexander to her study once again, though this meeting bore little resemblance to their previous confrontation weeks earlier. "I have spent considerable time these past days reconsidering many things," Margaret began, her voice lacking the sharp certainty that had characterized their earlier exchange. "I watched you cross that hall toward her without hesitation, Alexander, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, that whatever I believed about duty and obligation, I could not force feeling where none existed, nor prevent it where it clearly did." Alexander studied his mother carefully, uncertain what to expect from this unexpected shift in her demeanor. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Margaret continued, choosing her words with evident care, "that I have spent my entire life believing duty and happiness were separate matters, that one must inevitably be sacrificed for the other. Watching Beatrice refuse to proceed with an arrangement she did not truly want, watching you choose honesty over convenience despite every consequence such honesty might bring, I find myself questioning whether that belief was ever entirely correct." Alexander felt something loosen in his chest that had remained tightly wound for weeks. "Mother, I do not say this to diminish what this family's traditions mean. nor what your own sacrifices throughout your life have cost you. But I cannot build my future on an arrangement that denies what I know, without doubt, to be true in my own heart." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window and the grounds beyond, grounds that had belonged to the Whitmore family for generations before either of them had been born. "Your father and I were matched in much the same way you and Beatrice were matched," she said finally, her voice carrying a weight of memory Alexander had rarely heard from her before. "I did not love him when we married, Alexander. I grew to love him, over years of shared responsibility and quiet companionship, but I did not begin our marriage with the certainty you seem to carry now regarding this young woman." "Do you regret it?" Alexander asked quietly. "I do not regret the life we built together," Margaret replied, "but I have often wondered what might have been different had either of us been given the choice you now find yourself facing." She turned back to face her son directly, her expression softening in a way Alexander had rarely witnessed. "I will not pretend the path ahead will be simple, Alexander. Marrying beneath your station, however unfairly that phrase describes a woman of clear character and worth, will bring challenges neither of us can fully anticipate. But I find, watching you these past weeks, that I would rather face those challenges alongside a son who is genuinely happy than continue insisting upon a tradition that would leave you, and quite possibly Beatrice as well, trapped in quiet misery for the sake of appearances." Alexander crossed the room and embraced his mother, an act of open affection rare between them, though one that felt, in this moment, entirely necessary. "Thank you," he said simply. "Do not thank me yet," Margaret replied, though her voice carried warmth rather than her earlier severity. "There remains considerable work ahead before this family's name can accommodate such a significant departure from expectation. Formal dispensation will be required, given the difference in standing between yourself and Miss Hastings. Such matters are rarely simple, nor swiftly resolved." "I understand," Alexander said, "but I am prepared to pursue whatever path proves necessary, however difficult that path might become." Over the following weeks, Alexander devoted himself entirely to securing the necessary permissions required for a match so far outside traditional expectation. He met with officials of the court, presented formal petitions explaining his intentions, and endured no small amount of skepticism from those who believed such unions threatened the established order upon which their society had long depended. Yet he persisted, drawing upon both his own considerable influence and his mother's unexpected but genuine support, until slowly, gradually, the path toward formal recognition began to clear. Throughout this period, Eleanor remained at her new position, uncertain of how matters within the Whitmore family were progressing, receiving only occasional letters from Alexander that spoke of progress, without revealing the full extent of the obstacles he continued navigating on her behalf. She found herself caught between hope and caution, unwilling to allow herself to believe too fully in a future that remained, despite everything, far from guaranteed. It was Charlotte who finally brought news that shifted everything, arriving unannounced at Eleanor's new residence one afternoon with an expression of barely contained excitement. "You must come with me," Charlotte said, hardly waiting for a proper greeting before launching into her explanation. "There is to be a gathering, a significant one, within the fortnight. The Duke has requested your presence directly this time, Eleanor, not through secrecy or hidden meetings, but openly, as an invited guest." Eleanor's heart raced at the news, though uncertainty tempered her excitement. "What kind of gathering?" "I do not know all the particulars," Charlotte admitted, "but I understand it concerns matters of considerable importance to the Whitmore family's future, and I understand too that the Duke was quite insistent that you attend." The gathering, when the day finally arrived, took place within the Grand Hall of Faircross itself, a location Eleanor had never before entered, despite her long association with Alexander. The hall, unlike the elaborate decoration she remembered from Ashcombe Manor, carried a more understated elegance, reflecting generations of quiet, established authority rather than ostentatious display. Nearly every family of consequence within the region had received invitations once again, drawn this time not by anticipation of a routine announcement, but by curiosity regarding what precisely the Whitmore family intended, following the scandal that had unfolded weeks earlier at the Ashcombe gathering. Beatrice herself had been invited, along with her father, an inclusion that surprised many guests given the circumstances of their previous encounter, though Beatrice accepted the invitation without hesitation, curious to witness how the situation she had helped unravel might finally resolve itself. Eleanor arrived escorted by Charlotte, dressed in a gown provided, she later learned, at Duchess Margaret's own direction, a gesture that struck her as remarkable given their previous, distant relationship. As she entered the hall, murmurs rippled through the assembled guests, curious glances following her progress toward the center of the room, where Alexander stood waiting alongside his mother. "You look as though you belong here," Alexander said softly. Once Eleanor reached his side, his expression carrying a warmth that seemed to steady the nervous uncertainty she had carried throughout the journey to Faircross. "I am not certain I feel that way," Eleanor admitted quietly. "But I am grateful, regardless, to be standing here beside you." Duchess Margaret stepped forward then, addressing the assembled guests with the same practiced composure Eleanor remembered from the earlier gathering, though this time her words carried an entirely different purpose. "I have called you all here this evening," Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "to address directly the events that transpired at the Ashcombe gathering some weeks past, and to clarify, before rumor and speculation continue distorting the truth beyond recognition, exactly what my family intends going forward." The hall remained utterly silent. Every guest, attentive to words they understood, carried considerable significance for the future standing of two of the region's most prominent families. "My son," Margaret continued, "has spent recent weeks pursuing formal dispensation to marry a woman of considerable character and worth, though one whose birth differs from what tradition might typically expect for a match of this standing. I confess I initially opposed this pursuit, believing tradition and obligation should outweigh personal happiness. I no longer hold that belief with the certainty I once did." Margaret paused, allowing her words to settle over the assembled guests before continuing. "The necessary dispensation has now been secured, following considerable deliberation among the appropriate authorities. I stand before you this evening not merely to announce a marriage, but to affirm, with genuine conviction, that this family fully supports the union my son intends to pursue." She turned then toward Alexander, gesturing for him to step forward. Alexander did not hesitate this time, as he had at the previous gathering. Instead, he crossed the remaining distance toward Eleanor, taking her hand gently within his own, exactly as he had done once before beneath the broken archway of the old chapel ruins, though this time the act took place before the full attention of the entire assembled court, witnessed by nobility and rivals alike, with nothing hidden and nothing left to whisper or speculate about any longer. "Eleanor Hastings," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "I have spent these past months understanding, more fully with each passing day, exactly what I feel for you, and exactly what I am willing to risk in order to build a future alongside you, rather than apart. I do not offer you simply a title, nor merely the security such a title might provide. I offer you the whole of what I am, imperfect and uncertain as that offering might sometimes prove, in the hope that you might consider building a life together with me, openly and without further secrecy." Eleanor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she made no effort to hide them, understanding that whatever composure the moment might traditionally demand mattered far less than the genuine emotion she felt standing there, hand in hand with a man who had chosen her, publicly and irrevocably, despite every obstacle placed before them. "I accept," she said simply, her voice steady despite the tears, "not because of the title you offer, but because of the man who offers it." A murmur of approval moved through the assembled guests, considerably different in tone from the shocked silence that had greeted the collapse of the previous engagement. Whatever reservations some guests may have privately held regarding a match so far outside traditional expectation, the evident sincerity of the moment, and the clear support offered by Duchess Margaret herself, left little room for the kind of scandal Eleanor had once feared her association with Alexander might inevitably invite. Near the edge of the gathered crowd, Beatrice watched the exchange with an expression that carried genuine warmth rather than any lingering resentment. When Eleanor's gaze happened to meet hers briefly across the hall, Beatrice offered a small, sincere smile, an acknowledgement that whatever complicated circumstances had brought them to this moment, she held no regret regarding the choice she herself had made weeks earlier at Ashcombe Manor. Lord Henry, standing beside his daughter, appeared considerably less pleased by the evening's proceedings, though even he understood the futility of further protest, given how thoroughly the situation had already resolved itself beyond his control. He said nothing throughout the remainder of the gathering, choosing instead the quieter dignity of accepting circumstances he could no longer meaningfully alter. As the evening progressed, guests gradually approached Alexander and Eleanor to offer their congratulations, some with genuine warmth, others with the practiced courtesy expected of such occasions regardless of private opinion. Charlotte, watching from a comfortable distance with tears of her own gathering in her eyes, felt an overwhelming sense of pride witnessing her friend's transformation from anxious governess to a woman standing confidently beside the man she loved, before the very court that had once threatened to tear them apart entirely. Later that evening, once the formal proceedings had concluded and guests had begun departing into the cool night air, Alexander and Eleanor found a quiet moment together near the edge of the grand hall, away from the lingering crowd. I never imagined, that first night in the rain, that we would eventually stand here together like this, Eleanor said softly, gazing around the hall that would soon become, in every meaningful sense, her home as well. Nor did I, Alexander admitted, drawing her closer. Though I confess, even then, something told me our meeting was not simply chance. Eleanor smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as the last of the evening's guests made their way toward waiting carriages beyond the grand entrance. Whatever brought us together that night, I am grateful for it, storm and all. Outside, the night had cleared considerably, since the earlier gathering at Ashcombe Manor. Stars scattered brightly across a sky no longer threatening rain or storm, but instead offering quiet, steady light over the grounds of Faircross Hall. Within the walls of that grand estate, a future once thought impossible had finally, openly, begun, built not upon obligation or arrangement, but upon the simple, enduring truth that had first drawn two unlikely people together, on a stormy evening months before, a truth neither tradition nor scandal had ultimately proven strong enough to break. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Duke who had defied expectation to marry the woman he loved spread throughout the wider court, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, though the essential truth remained constant regardless of embellishment. Theirs became a match remembered not for the scandal that had nearly prevented it, but for the quiet courage both Alexander and Eleanor had shown in choosing honesty over convenience, and love over the comfortable, familiar weight of tradition alone. And though the wider court would continue, as courts always do, to whisper and speculate about matters both significant and trivial, none among them could deny the simple truth witnessed that evening within the grand hall of Faircross, a truth captured in the moment Alexander had taken Eleanor's hand before them all, unashamed and unwavering, choosing her openly at last.